Now, it normally discusses matters of war and peace, from coups and war crimes to nuclear treaty violations. Today, the UN Security Council discussed climate change, with the Prime Minister telling delegates that the rising global temperature poses a real threat to global security. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, joins me now from the newsroom. Alex.
Yes, and I might sound like the fifth horseman of the apocalypse, but it has been quite a day for the diplomacy of the abyss. First time a British Prime Minister has chaired a UN Security Council session like this since back in 1992, and as you say, completely different and very pressing theme. Consider this one fact. Of the 20 countries most at risk from the current climate crisis, 12 are already in conflict. And the urgency of dealing with that in the wider context of the climate crisis was very much the theme for Boris Johnson. Britain, of course, the leading driving force coming up to the vital climate conference in Glasgow in November. But the star of the show, undoubtedly, David Attenborough, who laid out his vision of what we face if we don't act. Don't forget, this isn't politics, it's just science, it's physics, it's chemistry, it's biology. David Attenborough.
We are today perilously close to tipping points that, once passed, will send global temperatures spiralling catastrophically higher. If we continue on our current path, we will face the collapse of everything that gives us our security. Food production, access to fresh water, habitable ambient temperature, and ocean food chains.
Far from alone, of course, domestically this afternoon, the boss of the Environment Agency telling insurers in this country we are already facing tipping point events. He said we must build out of this far better than we went into it, and he said, of course, it's a problem which dwarfs something like the pandemic in terms of its scope and its potential.
You mentioned the Environment Agency, and the Environment Secretary has been out talking to farmers today, hasn't he? What has he had to say?
Indeed, we're hearing more from him in a moment, of course. But yes, he's really talking about how we redefine farming. Very briefly, we've moved from the old CAP in the EU, the Common Agricultural Policy, to now, well, what? Brexit, redefining farming. What is it to farm? Is it just to produce food as it was in the big days of industrial and intensive CAP farming? Or is it something more holistic, more broad, encouraging farmers, indeed paying farmers to look after biodiversity? But how do we pay them? How do we make them do that? We are not yet at any kind of solution to that. Huge amount of work to be done, not a lot of time.
Indeed. Alex, thanks very much. Well, during that speech at the National Farmers Union earlier, the Environment Secretary, George Eustice, said that farmers were now benefiting from increased confidence because of leaving the European Union, with profits up in many sectors and lamb and beef prices at 10-year highs. He went on to list the many benefits he believed would follow from leaving the EU, pointing to the UK's self-sufficiency in food production increasing for the first time since 2014. I spoke to him earlier. Secretary of State, you listed in your speech to the NFU all the benefits of leaving the EU. But I wonder what you say to the pig exporters who can't export their animals, the daffodil growers who say they're having to leave flowers rotting in the field because they simply can't get the European labourers that they used to have, or even the high street sandwich chain who's had to apologise because they say they can't get the fresh food ingredients for the sandwiches.
Well, I've talked to many of these sectors, and when it comes to the pig sector, there had been a particular issue around one type of test that the Dutch officials at one point were requesting. That's now being resolved. The biggest challenge on the pig sector at the moment is disruption in the Chinese market. And likewise, when it comes to the daffodil industry, much of which is in my constituency, again, I've talked to producers. They would have had major challenges this time anyway because of the quarantine restrictions. And that's the main reason why labour that would normally come has not come. But we are looking at their future labour needs through a future seasonal workers scheme, and we intend to look at adding the ornamental sector at that point.
Isn't the reality that the problems of COVID are masking the very many problems of leaving the EU?
Well, I don't think so. The reality is that our worst case scenario planning for the end of the transition period, actually we're preparing for us to need to procure government ferries to get critical goods in. We were envisaging that there could have been major disruption at the border with lorries not flowing. In the event none of that happened, we do now have flows of around 7,000 to 8,000 lorries per day that are making the crossing, without any issues. Yes, there's additional paperwork. Yes, they have to do customs declarations now, but business have got used to that, and the trades continue to flow. So by and large, while of course there's been some additional processes and administrative costs that are unwelcome, things have actually gone quite well.
Well, you've said businesses are getting used to all of that, but Neal's Yard Dairy tell us that their truck exporting to Calais is being held up sometimes for 56 hours, and they said to us it's a royal mess. What do you say to them?
Well, I think that would be the exception. We've been monitoring those times quite closely. It's now the case that around 55% of consignments are getting through in less than an hour, typically about 45 minutes, and around over 90% are getting through within 3 hours.
So if it's not your worst case scenario, how would you describe the troubles that we're seeing?
Generally speaking, there's been teething issues. So there were problems in the initial weeks of some businesses having, prepared, but sometimes using the wrong type of export health certificate. There were some challenges with import agents not properly pre-declaring that goods were on their way on the EU's IT systems. Those types of problems have been ironed out. So generally it was teething problems. But what we are left with at the end of it, and I don't deny this, is that because we've left the customs union and because we've left the single market, we had to do that if we wanted to regain control of our own laws. And that does mean that there are some additional administrative processes that the EU requires. And obviously there is a cost to that. And I accept that some businesses would rather not have that cost, but it is the price, if you like, of having democracy and self-government.
Well, teething problems is how you've described it. But some businesses, like the shellfish exporters, for example, are facing ruin.
Well, generally speaking, as I said, it's been teething problems in terms of people's readiness to use the export health certificates and familiarise themselves with that. We have had a specific issue on bivalve molluscs, that is mussels and cockles and oysters in particular, where these have been built on a model of going to restaurants in places like France and being purified whilst on site. The EU had said originally that that trade could continue. Their own laws provide for it to continue and actually refer to a certificate that would enable it to continue. But they have had a change of heart, a policy change. And although there's no legal impediment to this trade, the European Union told us a couple of weeks ago that they weren't going to allow it to continue.
Well, actually,
so we're working with them on that.
To be clear, they haven't had a change of heart. They've said quite specifically the rules in this area have not changed. They have applied and continue to do so to all third countries. This is not new, and it is not a surprise to the UK administration. You should have known about it all along.
No, this is a trade that they don't do with any other third country. And it is somewhere where they've changed their position. We had
That's not what they say. Either they're right.
No, they're not right.
Right, they're wrong.
Not right. They are wrong. We do know what they say. We're very familiar with this body of law. We lived with it for 50 years, and we've got technical experts in this area. We had actually discussed it with the Commission, and the Commission had told us the trade could continue.
Are they just making it up then?
Yes, they told us the type of export health certificate that could be used, and their own both public health and animal health laws do provide for the trade to continue. What happened is that the Commission decided, and this was a late decision, that they only took on the first week of February, that they were actually going to change their mind and not allow that trade to continue after all.
So what are you going to do about it?
Well, we're in a dialogue with them because it's an indefensible decision. There's no public health or even animal health grounds for these sorts of restrictions. So we're obviously trying to persuade them to change that. If they don't, then we will support the industry to invest in our own depuration equipment in this country so that the trade can continue.
But a lot of exporters won't have time for that. They will go bust in the meantime. Can you guarantee that the government won't let a single shellfish exporter go bust because of Brexit?
Well, what I can say is that yesterday we announced a new scheme to help those shellfish businesses that have been affected by this extraordinary EU decision, to help them with their fixed costs while we find a solution.
So, but can you guarantee that you're not going to let a single one of these businesses go bust because of the decision that you took to leave the EU?
Well, of course, I can't guarantee what will happen to individual businesses. What I can guarantee is that the government is there to support them. And this week, we've opened a fund that they are eligible to apply to help cover their fixed costs.
George Eustace, thanks very much.
Thank you.